Okay, can I just check everyone at the back can hear okay? Yeah, fantastic. All right, so welcome to this session on looking at the combination of carbon credits and the fit with carbon credits and corporate strategy. It's fantastic to be talking to businesses because so often in this industry, I'm sure many of you will agree, we end up talking to ourselves, and actually this is the important conversation to be having. So really, really delighted to be here. I'm Andrea Abrahams. I'm the Managing Director at ICROA for Voluntary Carbon Markets and the ICROA Accreditation Program. The ICROA Accreditation Program, for those of you who've never heard of it before, is basically a way to badge good quality providers of carbon offsets and carbon offsetting services. So it's an accreditation for the service providers. If anyone wants to know more about that, or the ICROA, which is the International Emission Trading Association, member-based association, please do come and talk to me afterwards. So, when we start off thinking about this subject and how this all comes together, the first thing to remind ourselves is the absolute urgency of action. You don't need me to remind you that we're in a dire position right now in terms of meeting our global goals as a community within the UK in particular, and action by everybody, all participants, is really urgently needed. Now, the voluntary carbon market is really a tool that you have in your toolkit. It will never be the only solution. It is not the panacea to climate change, but it is a very, very useful tool. The strong value proposition for the voluntary carbon market is that it's available now. Right now, you can invest in carbon projects which are reducing emissions and supporting ecosystems and supporting livelihoods. These are fantastic initiatives. They are all over the world and they are desperately in need of finance. These initiatives would not happen without climate finance. That's the definition of what makes a carbon project a carbon project. They would simply not happen without carbon financing. So you have an opportunity to make a difference today. When we think about and look at the COP27 negotiations, a really critical part of those negotiations was under what we call Article 6. So it's the clause around carbon trading. This is seen within the Paris Agreement as a really critical component to helping deliver Paris. And it's not surprising that parties to the agreement are spending a lot of time agonizing on the detail of being able to trade emission reductions between parties. Why is that important? It's important because different companies or different countries, are going to be in different positions in terms of delivering their Paris agreements. Some countries are going to have reductions to sell. Others are going to be really struggling to meet their NDC, their nationally determined contribution, and are going to need to buy carbon credits. So the Paris Agreement allows for the trading of emission reductions in order to do three things: deliver emission reductions most quickly and most urgently, deliver reductions equitably across countries, and to deliver emission reductions and the energy transition at the lowest possible cost. These are really sort of critical components to delivering the Paris Agreement. So what was really particularly interesting at COP is that this was the conversation happening very soberly within the negotiating rooms. But outside of the negotiating rooms, in what is referred to as the side events, the most topical conversation was the voluntary carbon market. It was absolutely fascinating. If you had any doubt that this market has a role to play, you only needed to be there. There were new initiatives launched around demand, such as the African Carbon Markets Initiative. So a whole lot of countries in Africa getting together to say, our potential in terms of developing carbon stocks is completely undervalued and not tapped. We have a huge potential here to increase carbon stocks and to protect our nature-based solutions. And there was a myriad of those types of initiatives. And you also had, on the other hand, a number of guidelines which were being launched, such as the UN High-Level Integrity Group, the ISO guidelines. So there was just so much conversation about exactly what we're talking about here. What is the role that the private sector can play in supporting carbon reduction through the voluntary carbon market? What are good quality carbon credits? How do I know they're good quality carbon credits? What do I pay for them? Where do I find them? All of those questions were exactly what was under discussion. So just before I introduce the panel, and if you're not very familiar with carbon markets, I just want to say this is an amazing panel. It really is. I don't know, how we quite orchestrated getting you lot together on one table, but honestly, it really is super. But just before I do that, I thought it would be helpful as we're talking to you in business and really trying to understand what the issues are that you're facing. A helpful starting place would be to know what level of understanding there is in the market, in the room on voluntary carbon markets. So if you feel you're not very familiar, got a bit of knowledge, but sort of on the low end, would you mind raising your hand? Okay, I'd say, and then if you really understand the market quite well, sort of almost regard yourself as perhaps an expert within your company, if you would raise your hand. Okay, very few. So I would say that we have a medium to low understanding of the market, and I think that's helpful just for us to know sort of how to frame our responses. Please just put your hand up if there's any acronyms. This industry is terrible for acronyms, and we slip into it accidentally. So please do just raise your hand if we've said anything that you don't understand. So to introduce our speakers, I'm going to talk side on like this. First of all, we have Andrew from the UK Woodland Carbon Code. And he's going to talk more about the importance of the carbon code in the UK in particular. We have Maria Cavallo, and Maria is the head of climate and economics at NatWest. We have Ben Rattenbury, who's vice president of policy for Silvera, really interesting, fairly new market player. How many years would you say? 2.5 years. And then at the end, we have Emma Watson, who's head of standards for the Science Based Targets Initiative, an important initiative which I'm sure a lot of you have heard about. Okay, so I'm just going to try and sit down now. Hopefully I don't lose the speaker. Okay, the way we're going to run the discussion is we're actually going to split it into two halves. We're going to start off talking about supply and what does quality of carbon credit supply look like. And then we're going to move into the demand side creation and what are the frameworks and guidance on the demand side. And between them we'll do questions and answers so that we don't leave it all towards the end. So moving on, we're going to start off with Andrew. So Andrew, just looking at the Woodland Carbon Code, the question around quality is really critical in the carbon markets.
Yeah.
And being able to understand as a buyer what quality looks like. So if you wouldn't mind talking to us about how you approach that, and in particular how buyers can know what quality looks like.
Absolutely. Can everyone hear me? Everyone at the back? No one? Can everyone hear me now? Okay. So, hi everyone. So as Andrea said, my name's Andrew Baker. I work for Scottish Forestry. So we govern the Woodland Carbon Code for all woodland creation schemes in the UK. If they're looking to generate carbon units from woodland creation. They come through us. We then predict how many carbon units are likely to be sequestered over the lifetime of the woodland, and then units can be assigned based upon that. And net zero claims, carbon neutrality, can then be followed through by buyers of those carbon units. So to answer your question, Andrea, first and foremost, there are many international carbon code principles that you must adhere to. And as Andrea already outlined, ICROA are one of those organizations that do that. And so the Woodland Carbon Code is endorsed by ICROA. Now, these carbon principles are very wide-ranging, but just to give you a flavor of some of them, one of them, for instance, is permanence. There needs to be a confidence that the removal of carbon or the reduction of carbon is going to be permanent. And for us in the UK and for woodland creation in the UK, we're quite fortunate because there's a huge amount of government protection over woodland creation. And if you were ever to cut a woodland down, it has to be replanted within a certain time frame. They're all protected over something called UKFS, the UK Forestry Standard. There's also other things like the measurability of carbon in any ecosystem or any sort of technological solution to carbon removals. You need to be able to be sure that you can accurately measure the removal. And we're quite fortunate again in forestry because drone technology advancing, LiDAR, that sort of thing, can incredibly accurately estimate what the biomass was at the baseline, at the start of the project, and as it grows, how much carbon is being sequestered over time. And then a final one that I was going to touch on was additionality. This is something that's an incredibly important principle, and it's important for you guys as well if you're looking at buying carbon units. You want to know that the money you're investing in these different projects is genuinely contributing to a reduction in the amount of carbon in the atmosphere, into a removal of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And so you don't want just to give money to business as usual. And so this is crucially important as a cornerstone of carbon markets as well. And all of these build into that credibility and the quality of carbon units, as Andrew was describing. A really important part of it as well, sorry I'm taking ages, is about the transparency of these carbon units as well. You need to be able to see a public-facing open register of who has bought these units, what they've been used for, who is supplying the units, that sort of thing. So those are some things just to keep your eye out for when you're looking at different carbon standards. Do they have a public registry? Do they have endorsement by ICROA? Do they guarantee additionality, permanence, etc., etc.? And if they don't, or don't have a ready answer for that, red flags should be going up. And then finally, for us, one thing with woodlands again, is all of the co-benefits associated with woodland creation. So you have biodiversity gain, flood mitigation, water purification. All of these different things in the Woodland Carbon Code are scored out of 5 on our woodland benefits tool. So it's also useful to look a bit broader than just the carbon. The carbon's a great skeleton for you to look at investing, whereas if you're looking more widely, there are a lot of associated benefits that can come from carbon sequestration as well.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Andrew. So we're going to move on and pick up on some of those points with Maria. As we said, Maria works for NatWest, so she's coming at this from a business's perspective. Do you look at quality in the same way? How do you assess it? And a really important point in this market is price a benchmark of quality?
Hi everyone, and thank you so much, Andrea and Andrew, for teeing that up. So when it comes to NatWest, NatWest has launched something called the Carbon Place, which is a platform that helps buyers and sellers actually buy and sell credits. And one of the key questions that has come through the Carbon Place is meant to be an international platform that works through banks. So ultimately, you don't have to go to something separate. You can go to your bank, and the bank can put you onto that platform, and then there's the identification for good quality credits. As a bank, which is very heavily regulated, and our credibility is on the line on what goes on that platform, it is independently, it's going to be its own independent founding, but as a founding member of it, the bank and specifically the NatWest Markets team has gone through a rigorous exercise and very much of a learning exercise. They decided to do this last year. The amount of learning on what is a good quality credit is very essential. One of the things that they've come out with is then learning through ICROA. So one of the key requirements if carbon credits do go onto the carbon place is that it has to be accredited by ICROA. So it has to be credits that have been issued from a carbon standard that has been accredited by ICROA. So that's the number one thing. The second thing is then thinking through in terms of price. Actually, so this has been an interesting thing that the bank has gone through a learning practice, which is it's what they look at is beyond the carbon standard, what is the project type? And that has also been a learning for them with regards to this discussion on those types of credits that remove emissions from the atmosphere versus thinking through what quality needs to look like for those emissions that are about forest conservation versus those credits that are about reducing emissions from typical, like from industry, from homes, and really thinking through quality by project type. Nature-based solutions has been one of the most, from a bank's perspective, one of the most controversial ones, but that's why we look at, and that has been one of the key learnings from the bank, is to understand that that's what the role of a carbon standard is, and that's actually the quality of a carbon credit is really relies on the carbon standard itself to be very rigorous in how it certifies it and how you can track it. If it doesn't have that good quality, and especially on their approach towards whether it's a forest conservation project or an afforestation or reforestation project, really thinking through, as Andrew said, those principles are very critical. So then that goes into the carbon project. The problem with the price right now and using as a price reference is that there's no singular place. Part of the reason Carbon Place was set up was to find some ways in which you can get standardized contracts, and you can see not only in terms of the quality of the credit, but then what the prices are. Right now, the market is so divergent on those prices, and there's not as much price transparency. What they've become, and also because supply and demand right now is so volatile, that to use pricing as your way of determining quality is very difficult. Because again, to the point on there's a very small supply of removals credits, and a big demand for them, which gives it a high price. That does not mean it's a better quality than a very good forest conservation project. And that took a lot of learning from the bank to really realize it's about high quality carbon standards and the principles they certify to that then determine the quality of the credit, not necessarily if the price is dictated by supply and demand balances.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really interesting point, because price is impacted clearly by supply and demand, but it's also impacted by the underlying cost of developing that project.
Yeah.
The cost of developing a wind farm is different from the cost of protecting a rainforest in the Amazon, is different from a fuel switching project, is different from a cook stove project. So the underlying cost of actually developing that project differs, and it does not necessarily mean that a lower price project is dodgy. It's just an important point to be aware of, because sometimes when people talk about the quality, they think cheap is bad. It really is not necessarily the case. A low-cost project could still be removing or avoiding a ton of carbon from being emitted. It's just that the cost of developing that project is lower.
The other thing about quality, I mean, just this is why in terms of beyond the project type and beyond the carbon standards, and it's not a plug and a segue to Ben, but it is looking at new types of assessors for Silvera. So things like Silvera to help in actually assessing what the quality of a good credit is. And so it's nice to see in the market a lot of new ways of assessment beyond what is typically used. But to Andrea's point, price is not the determining factor.
Yeah. The last point on price, sorry, it just has really got me thinking, is what you were saying as well in the beginning, that if you are, it's a RED project and you're protecting a standing rainforest, there are people that live in that rainforest, and those people would need to, for example, be taught in alternative methods to form a livelihood as opposed to chopping down the trees. That change, that development of skills takes time and costs money. So those are the kind of things that can really impact on your project development costs. You mentioned technology and LiDAR and satellite for the measurement of carbon stocks, but the other area where we see a massive surge in growth in technology is around what we broadly talk about as the rating agencies. So Ben, over to you to just speak a little bit more about what Silvera is bringing to the market in terms of trying to understand quality.
Thanks very much, Andrea. I hope everyone can hear me, but if not, please give me feedback, thumbs up, thumbs down. I'll try and speak up.
Closer.
It's very hard to regulate
Closer.
volume here. I can just hear people outside. Anyway, hi everyone,
Ben.
lovely to meet you.
Sorry, they say you need to
Is
hold
it
closer.
even louder? Okay. Hi everyone.
Okay.
Nice to be here. Thank you very much, Andrea, for the invitation. It really is an honour to be on this panel. 3 excellent speakers plus me. I'm very glad to have snuck onto this one. But I'm afraid I'm going to be a bit boring and basically agree with what we've already heard. So not much controversy here, but essentially I agree with what Andrew and Maria have said about quality, but I can unpack that a little bit. So briefly, I'm Ben. I work for Silvera, which is a carbon credit ratings agency. So think Moody's for carbon. That's it, basically. That's all you need to know. We're about 2.5 years old now, London-based climate tech startup. And what we do is help buyers in the voluntary carbon market ensure that what they are buying is high quality. Because as some of you may know, there is an incredible diversity of credits in the voluntary carbon market, a wide range of standards, of vintages, which means how old a project is or how old a credit is specifically, a wide range of locations, wide range of project developers. There is so much heterogeneity, and unsurprisingly, there is also subsequently a wide range in quality. And how we define quality we can come to in a second, but essentially that quality is hidden from buyers in the market on the whole. And that's why some buyers are tempted to use some proxies, which end up being false proxies, such as price, to try and get a shortcut to determine quality. The way that we define quality for carbon credits is by applying the common rules of thumb, which are pretty much standard now within the sector, which are that emissions reductions have to be real, they have to be additional, and they have to be permanent. So what does that mean? Well, real means that you need to be able to demonstrate that emissions reductions have genuinely happened, either emissions reductions below a credible baseline or emissions reductions against a baseline of 0 if you're looking at removals. So firstly, are the emissions reductions real? And the way that we would assess that would depend on the project type. So for example, for a forestry project, we would use some of the technology that we've already heard about. We would use satellite data, we would use machine learning to interpret that satellite data, going back in time historically to look at changes on the ground. We're also starting to use LiDAR, which is laser scanning, basically like radar but using pulses of light instead of radio waves, which is a method of determining the 3-dimensional structure of a forest and getting a more accurate understanding of the total amount of biomass that is stored in that bit of forest. And that's training the next generation of machine learning models that look at the satellite data to tell you how much carbon is being stored or lost on the ground. For a renewables project, the carbon accounting is completely different. You have to look at the amount of low carbon electricity that's being put onto a national energy grid and then compare that against the baseline of what would have happened otherwise. So what is the average carbon intensity of that particular energy system, not including that renewable source that deliver that energy. So it's horses for courses depending on the project type, but essentially you need to know that the emissions reductions are real from a given activity. So this is the first pillar. The second pillar is additionality, which is a bit of carbon markets jargon that basically means, would these emissions reductions have occurred without the carbon crediting project? So you could have a renewables project which genuinely reduces emissions, but it may have been that renewables project would have happened regardless of the revenue from selling carbon credits, because it is just economically viable to run that project regardless. And actually that's a big challenge with many of the renewables credits on the market today, is that they have high carbon accounting scores but low additionality because of the economics of the project. And then the third component is the permanence, which is to what extent stage is collapsing behind me. I'll try and carry on.
It's kind of funny it came with permanence, but okay.
Yeah, so we do not have a permanent stage back here, but hopefully it will last for the rest of this session. Permanence essentially looks at to what extent are those emissions reductions going to remain emissions reductions for the foreseeable future. So this is of course a challenge for forestry projects where you could have some kind of loss event, a fire or a flood, which obliterates a chunk of forest, and then the emissions reductions have unfortunately vanished. And there are ways to model the likelihood of that happening, and so that's another component to our ratings. We also look at the co-benefits of projects, which is very important to many buyers as a fourth component. Anyway, that's just a brief overview. I've spoken for way too long. Sorry, Andrea, I've blown through your time limit. But hopefully that gives a helpful introduction to what we do.
Thank you. It's very weird here because we can hardly hear each other, so we just have to take it for granted that you can hear. It's because the sound all goes that way, so it's a bit odd. Emma, we'll come back to you on the demand side. So we're just going to move to questions and answers now to make sure that everyone's comfortable with this discussion on what is the supply and what is good quality supply. And we have a roving mic. There's a gentleman in the front here, and then directly behind him, and then on the far side.
Hi, thank you. My name is Phil Nisbesma, and my question is for Andrew, and it's about trees.
Excellent.
And how they work. Because a sapling is very little use for absorbing carbon dioxide, and it's not until a tree is many years old that it starts to absorb carbon. So do you profile the carbon credit to recognise the fact that immature trees are ineffective?
No, that's a great question. So one thing to take one step backwards is there are two different types of units generally. There are ex-ante and ex-post credits. So an ex-ante credit is essentially saying the carbon hasn't yet been sequestered. It is a prediction for carbon being sequestered in the future. An ex-post credit is saying the carbon has been sequestered, it is locked up and it is permanent. So many standards only work with ex-post. They say we're not going to give you, as a project developer, any credits until the carbon is actually there and sequestered. At the Woodland Carbon Code, we allow for both. So we will say, okay, this woodland, over a 100-year period, this woodland creation scheme, is likely to sequester 500 tons of carbon dioxide over 100 years. So once you've planted it and all of the information has been validated by a third party, we will then we will give you 500 pending issuance units that will, over that 100 years, if all goes well, evolve into 500 woodland carbon units. And that's essentially demonstrating or acknowledging what you're describing here. You haven't actually sequestered anything in year one. If anything, you've probably emitted a bit of carbon ploughing the ground or growing the trees or making the fencing or whatever it may be. And so this assignment allows, essentially the reason for doing this is because it's very difficult cash flow wise to convince a farmer or a landowner, look, in 50 years we'll give you 10 grand per hectare for your carbon. Well, that's no use to them. They need a cash flow coming in now. And so these pending units help that cash flow. So you're absolutely right, the trees do take time to grow, and that's how it's represented. But I'd be happy to go through that more with you afterwards, if that's okay.
And just to reiterate a really critical point you said there, project developers are not marking their own homework. They give a view, as you've just said, on this is how many credits we anticipate this project will deliver. 1 credit equals 1 ton. So this is how many tons of carbon we anticipate to be sequestered following this methodology. Again, methodologies are independent. And then they'll have an independent auditor who will come and verify that that activity has taken place, and only then can the carbon credits be sold post-ante, as you were saying.
And following on from that, Andrew, as well, just to clarify, those two different types of units are crucially important to the buyer based on what claims can be made upon them. So if I was a company and I had 500 tons of residual emissions this year, I'd done everything I could to reduce my emissions down, and this was my 500 tons remaining, and I bought 500 woodland carbon units, those ex-post, it is sequestered. I could say in my greenhouse gas inventory, this year we are carbon neutral. Whereas if I bought 500 pending issuance units, those ex-ante units, all I could say is we are working towards carbon neutrality. So it's very important to understand the difference between them from a buyer perspective as well.
Gentleman, yes?
Yeah, thank you for this. My name is Rhys Jones, I'm from the Carbon Trust as Net Zero Manager there. And my question was mainly around permanence, because last year when I was here there was a debate over whether 100 years was long enough for permanence, and I just wonder if there's been any movement on that question.
unless anyone else wants to.
Sure.
You sure?
I can have a go after you.
Okay, I'll be very quick. So no, it's a really good question, and it is tricky because you've got the geological timescales of 1,000, 10,000 years, but then on the other side of the argument, you've got, well, the climate emergency is now. We've got 20, 30 years in which to make these rapid changes. And so, as far as I'm aware, that 100 years is still the generally internationally accepted standpoint, but there are firm views on either side. So I'm not sure, Ben, if you had anything more to jump in on.
Just to add that there's been a lot of interesting discussion around the concept of ton-year accounting, which, for those who aren't aware, is the idea that you can divide units into the individual impact that they can have on global emissions within each given year. So, depending on the discount rate that you would apply, you can say that 17 ton years, so basically delaying a harvest for 1 year, which could produce, say, 17 ton years of emissions reductions or avoidance, that would be equal to one ton for 100 years. So it's kind of a bit of a quirky concept, but it's gaining currency in some circles because it deals with exactly the point that Andy just touched on, which is that climate change is not something for us to worry about in 100 years or in 1,000 years. It's something we have to worry about right now. We have less than a decade on our current trajectories to massively reduce emissions, and so there is a real risk of letting the perfect be the enemy of the good and setting the bar too high on permanence, and actually, in the meantime, avoiding all of the much easier mitigation that you can apply now at low cost and at big scale, which may not have quite such perfect permanence record.
You can see this topic really gets people going. So, Maria?
I mean, also from a buyer's perspective, and this is something that as those who are going to sell credits, it's very important for buyers as well, the discussion on permanence. One of the key critical things is also in thinking in the role of a bank on how do you finance and ensure financing of climate solutions. Recognizing that timescale of what are the practical ways in which you create safeguard mechanisms and what does it need to look like. So going back to Ben's point on the enemy of the good, if we wait until we get the perfect 100 years solutionized, and believe me, this is not just nature-based solutions, it's also technical removals. So please tell me what does the verification code look like and the system that carbon capture and utilization and storage will permanently store for 100 years carbon. To think that this is just a nature-based solutions problem is a misnomer. This is why I always go back into the principle, the carbon standard, and what are those safeguard mechanisms, and really thinking through practically. So the temporary credit solution is one of those innovative solutions. Actually, it was the first that was done for nature-based. But in thinking through that, it's really looking at, in the pursuit of 100 years, if it means then I don't qualify forest conservation because it can't prove 100 and then I lose my forests, that's a worse outcome. So I really hope that when people are looking and getting their hackles up around permanence, they recognize we need practical solutions because we're losing our forests because we don't have proper safeguard mechanisms in place for them.
And, for one other view on this, watch the outcome from the Integrity Council for the voluntary carbon market and the issuance of the core carbon principles. That's had 5,000 comments from the public, and one of the big subjects within that is permanence. So that will be coming out sort of early next year. There was one more question. I think it was there. Yeah?
Yes. Thank you very much. You've talked a lot about, my name's Alan Burns, I should say that, Amberlink Energy. You've talked a lot about forestry. Could you say something about other nature-based solutions? I'm thinking about algae or possibly plants, the Salk Institute, and maybe they're take less time, and how you'd measure permanence and so on with those. Thank you.
You'd like to take it? Yeah?
Yeah, I'll very quickly.
You take it? Okay. And then if you try and be quick, because then we can do one more question.
Brilliant. Sorry to be me again. So yes, there are a lot of different standards actually in the UK at least being set up at the moment under the Natural England Investment Readiness Fund, NERF, N-E-I-R-F, and those include agroforestry, blue carbon, salt marsh. You've got the peatland carbon code at the moment as well, which is fantastic. And this comes back slightly to when we were talking about price as an indicator of quality. Peatland carbon units are generally a little cheaper than forestry, but peatland units are brilliant. It's not as easy a marketing sell perhaps for some companies, and so some companies choose forestry over peatland restoration because it's an easier sell perhaps. And so to go back to your question, in terms of other developing standards, hedgerow standards, lots of different things going on at the moment. Everything you can think of is being developed, but many of them are coming across those issues: permanence, additionality, what sort of protection is in place, etc., etc.
Grassland management, herders. We could go on. We're going to take one more question in the front here. Sorry, if you in the back have questions, please just make sure you raise your hand quite high that I don't miss you. But we'll take one last one here. If you could just introduce yourself,
Yeah,
sir.
I'm Zakaria, the Senior Energy Manager for London Borough of Bromley.
Can't hear you.
I'm Zakaria, the Senior Energy Manager for London Borough of Bromley. Actually, I just want to ask a question regarding voluntary carbon markets. Especially in developing countries, we are beginning to see governments talking about carbon tax, saying they will request developers or projects, or they will request developers and companies operating within their boundaries to pay for the amount of carbon they produce. So in the event that they tax companies or developers to pay for the carbon that they produce, that money that they earn, can they use that money to invest in projects and now use the carbon reduction and allow the developers to now reclaim that carbon reduction as credits? Is that how it works under voluntary carbon markets or not?
Okay, do you get it?
So I think you're essentially asking about carbon tax, how that could play into with voluntary carbon markets alongside that. How can that all work together?
Yes.
I can. And I don't know. So basically, no, it cannot. So if you do have, so what I mean by this is governments, if they set up a carbon price, this could either be through a carbon tax or emissions trading scheme. They will then decide whether carbon credits can be used as a surrender in lieu of paying the tax. There are only 12, so the EU does not allow for that at all. But Colombia, South Africa do. So there's about 12 countries in the world that have set a carbon tax or a carbon price or an emissions trading scheme that will allow carbon credits. But even those, it's not your choice on what credit you do. They have very strict rules on which are the carbon standards, what are the project types, what are the years in which that credit was issued. So there are very even strict rules in those countries, which will then determine whether a carbon credit can be used for government or carbon compliance.
Okay, great. All right, so we're going to move now on to the demand side creation. So, as companies trying to develop a climate strategy and think about the role that carbon credits could potentially play for offsetting purposes within that strategy, obviously the one thing you want to do is get it right. It should be a reputation enhancing activity. So what we're going to explore now is a little bit more about what the guidelines are that you follow and what help there is out there to make sure that you sort of go about it in the best way possible. So I'm going to turn first and foremost to Emma to talk about the Science-Based Targets Initiative and the guidelines that they provide.
Great, thank you, Andrea. Can you hear me?
Yes.
I can't hear myself at all, so this is a bit disconcerting. But hi everyone, so my name's Emma Watson. I'm the head of standards at the Science-Based Targets Initiative. I recently moved into this role, and previously I was working to develop the corporate net zero standard, which was the first standard for companies to set net zero targets in line with 1.5C. So if you haven't heard of the Science-Based Targets Initiative before, we are a partner organization with colleagues from WWF, World Resources Institute, the UN Global Compact, and CDP, which is where I work. And we were formed around about the time of the Paris Agreement talks, when I guess my founders recognized that companies were really calling out for guidance as to how they can align their corporate strategies with the Paris Agreement goals. So ever since then, what we've been focused on is developing guidance and tools for companies to set targets in line with originally well below 2C, but now we're totally focused on the goal of 1.5C. So the heart of what we do at the Science Based Targets Initiative is based on what's called the mitigation hierarchy. And this is a concept that was actually mentioned in the last panel that was at this stage. It's a very common concept, but sometimes people think that it's something that the SBTI came up with. It's absolutely not. It's been used for over 100 years in natural resource management. So what the original 4 steps are to avoid, reduce, restore, and compensate. So that can be applied to everything. It can be applied to energy, it can be applied to waste, reduce, reuse, recycle, but it should also be applied to the way that a company is addressing its emissions. So the way that we employ that within the Science Based Targets Initiative standards is that companies really need to be addressing their own emissions first. And their own emissions also includes their value chain. So looking at what their customers are doing, looking at what their suppliers are doing. Need to be setting targets to reduce those emissions in line with the science, and then setting strategies to then achieve those targets. So if we kind of look at that method that approach to net zero, which may not be the original approach that companies take, it's really important to understand that yes, it may be a bit more difficult, or well, a lot more difficult than just buying carbon credits. But we have to realize that net zero is not a goal that companies can reach in isolation. It's a global goal. So every single value chain has to be addressed. And who is best placed to address those value chain emissions apart from the people that are in that value chain, the companies themselves and their suppliers? However, I do want to say that there are some misconceptions around the SBTI's positions on carbon credits. So within the net zero standard, we have 4 key elements that a company should consider when setting their net zero targets. So the first is a near-term science-based target, so 5 to 10-year target to reduce emissions in line with 1.5C. The second element is a long-term science-based target. So that's how much you need to reduce your emissions by 2050 latest to be in line with 1.5C scenarios to limit or to get to net zero. So for most companies, that's a 90% reduction in emissions. It's a huge, huge goal. However, we do have 2 extra elements that I'll kind of talk about, which are much more relevant for today's discussion. So the first is what's called beyond value chain mitigation. So this is anything that you do on top of your science-based targets that is outside of your value chain. And this is where carbon credits would sit. And then the final piece of the puzzle is that you need to neutralize the remaining 10% of emissions with permanent carbon removals. Now, we haven't defined what permanent means at the Science Based Targets Initiative. You might see an article in Business Green today talking about a letter that we've been sent by a lot of scientists and others working in the technological space, and they advocate for 1,000-year permanence. So it's a very, it's an ongoing debate, and we really feel we need to put a lot of research and effort into making sure that we're making the right decision. But bearing in mind that that is the kind of the long-term 10% that we're looking at. So although the SBTI's focus is on value chain emission reductions and has been historically, we've recognized that we have become a bit of a de facto standard for credibility, and companies are looking at us for guidance on this above and beyond, the beyond value chain mitigation piece. We've had a lot of calls from stakeholders for extra guidance, and we responded to that because we really feel that we need to use every single tool in our toolbox. if we're going to be able to make it. We have 4,000 companies within the SBTI. It covers over a third of global market cap, but without regulation, we are never going to get there. Even if every single company does set a science-based target, there's emissions outside of the value chain that won't be addressed. So we really want to support people who are doing these extra efforts as much as possible. So we've kicked off a new project, the Beyond Value Chain Mitigation Project, very catchy name, we'll probably change it. And we're starting to think about this project with the 5 W's. So what is Beyond Value Chain Mitigation? We know it is reductions, we know it's removals, but there's also maybe a role to play for adaptation finance or policy advocation as well. So what is it that companies can do above and beyond their value chain emission reductions that would count as part of this extra effort? The next question that we're asking is where? So where does this finance need to go? We know that there is a huge gap of climate finance. So the IPCC has said that it needs to increase by 300 to 600% if we're able to meet the Paris climate goals. So that's a huge gap. And the corporate sector has been identified as being the place for that money that we can actually find that. So we want to try and figure out what that is. Very much linked to that is when. So when are we needing to put the climate, when do we need to direct that climate finance to what? So we know that there are ecosystems that are reaching tipping points that if we end up at those tipping points, it's absolutely game over. So the climate finance needs to go there. But we also know that we're going to need permanent carbon removal by the time we get to 2050, which is really, really, really expensive at the moment. So we need to make investments in that technology to get there if we are to achieve net zero as a planet. The next one is who. So how do we allocate responsibility to different companies? Some companies have historic emissions debt, but also they have huge abatement costs. It's going to cost them a lot of money to be able to meet their emission reduction targets. There are other companies, say the tech sector, that have high profits that could do this, but haven't had that necessarily had that emissions debt. So how do we allocate that responsibility? And for the Science-Based Targets Initiative, this is a really tough one because we can't really rely on the science. It's more of an ethical judgment. And then finally, why? So why would companies do this if science-based targets are already hard? We know we have these 4,000 companies already in the initiative. They're doing this voluntarily. So there is a business case. There's a lot of talk about claims. Claims are really important, but we do think that there are other things that we could find to incentivize companies as well. So that guidance is going to be released probably towards the end of next year. So hopefully that explains our position.
That's fantastic, Emma. Honestly, the SBTI has just done amazing work at trying to define the pathways towards net zero for us. And net zero has really become a massive rally cry for action. I think it's the one really positive thing we think we can all say about the term. But as you can see from what Emma's saying, a lot of this is evolving. So, if you're wanting to make a start today, like what are the simple building blocks to start off with? And maybe, Maria, you could just help us a little bit for that. If you were going to, if you weren't, you don't have a full enough understanding of every aspect of a climate strategy, what are the 4 or 5 fundamental building blocks to put in place?
So I think Emma's already covered it, but first is, and this is coming really from our perspective, so we have signed up to the Science-Based Targets Initiative. We set out a target of what the science-based pathway would be for us to decrease our emissions. This is not just the emissions that come from our buildings. It's not just the emissions that come from our electricity and heating. It is a very interesting exercise on a bank to think through the sectors they've financed. We've traditionally given financing. How do you rethink how we finance? And so step 1, actually estimate what your impact is, what we call our carbon footprint, right? So estimate what your scope 1, which is from your buildings, Scope 2, which is within your heating and electricity from your buildings, and then Scope 3 is, 1, also just the inputs into ours, but we're a bank, so it's going to be when we finance emissions and our customers, what is the estimated emissions that would be associated with that financing? So 1, for those who are starting this journey, actually measuring your carbon footprint. Then 2, thinking through what would actually be the pathway what would be the actions I would need to take to reduce my emissions. We went it a little the other way around because our CEO was very clear, climate is a central part of our pillar and it's a central part of our strategy. So if we're going to take this seriously, we follow the Science-Based Targets Initiative, which says you need to set those near-term and long-term targets. So we set that target, and that now we're going through developing a transition plan. So our transition plan is looking sector by sector, trying to understand what are the sectors that we're going to stop financing because their carbon footprint is so much and they don't have a transition plan to be within a net zero economy that's in line. What are the sectors we should be financing more? What are the solutions we need to be financing more? Because that critically will be part of a net zero economy. And then within that, how do you support customers? So in another way that's bank speak, if you're a financial institution out there, but another thing for you to think through is what are the actions you're going to take? So what do you have to stop doing? What do you have to do more of? And what are the transition parts of it? So really identifying those actions and measuring how much that would reduce to meet your target. And then afterwards thinking through, and again, I really do commend the Science-Based Targets Initiative for making it very clear on how you can support societal goals, global goals, but that is in no way a substitute for you addressing your own emissions. So even though it's clunky beyond value chain mitigation, it's still an important way of addressing that you can use carbon credits to basically support societal goals. So you can take things, and it's a way of thinking through that rule. I have done everything I can to reduce my own emissions in the time now. I should be financing and supporting societal goals, and I need to figure out how to drive that financing towards impact, which is one of the reasons why carbon credits is very attractive. You have a quantitative measure that you can then put against how much of that societal goals financing in comparison to my carbon footprint.
Sorry to just jump in, that's really useful as well. When you're looking at the price of carbon units, it's a really effective way of saying, right, I've got 1,000 units residual emissions this year. If I was to buy carbon units from this standard at £20 per tonne, if instead, rather than buying those units, we invested that into reducing our emissions through loft insulation, through whatever it may be, it's a good thing, particularly when you're speaking to senior executives or whoever it might be, to say, well, if we were just to go this way and just offset everything, it would cost us 100 grand every year from now on. Whereas if we were to put these measures in place now, okay, it's 300 grand now, but in the long term, it just puts that monetary argument to them quite effectively.
Then I'm just thinking about, so I think the one thing we would all agree on without doubt is the importance of the mitigation hierarchy and, putting a very stringent reduction activity in place. It's a little bit of a curveball question here, and then I'll go to you and then maybe to Emma. So what happens if there's a war and the price of energy really goes up and you therefore have to buy coal-based energy, which you wouldn't otherwise have done, which means as a company you miss your interim target. Now the SBTI rules say you can't use offsets towards your interim target. Does that not reduce ambition? Because actually you could have benefited the world if you had made up that gap of missing your target. So I just wonder, some reflections on this. Ben, let's start with you.
Thank you very much, Andrea, for the curveball. That's exactly what I was hoping for. Many of you will have heard of Lord Nick Stern, who wrote the Stern Review in, I think, 2006. Last year, he co-authored a letter with a number of luminaries in finance and carbon markets, and it's called The High Ambition Pathway to Net Zero. And essentially, it rolls into a couple of paragraphs what Emma was describing in terms of the mitigation hierarchy, and it's essentially saying it's not a ranked order of priorities. You really should do it all. So you absolutely have to decarbonize your own activities, scope 1, 2, and 3, as much as possible, as much as the science and technology allows. But you should also look to compensate all of your emissions at the same time using high quality carbon credits. And so there shouldn't be a trade-off. To the extent that companies are making profits, they have the ability to spend money on compensating their emissions. So I think in a way it's maybe a false dichotomy sometimes the way it's presented.
Thank you. I think that's an interesting way of thinking about it. So no trade-off. Emma, I guess it's a bit difficult from your point of view because it may be sort of creating a get-out-of-jail opportunity. Is that where you come at it from?
Well, I think if we're talking about electricity emissions, so there are different ways of accounting for your scope 2, your electricity emissions, that do allow for you to either use a national grid emission factor, or you can look at the actual electricity that you're purchasing. So if you're purchasing renewable electricity, you're using solar power and your own, offices or manufacturing sites, then you can account for it and you can demonstrate that. So that one, there is a bit of, I guess, offsetting in scope 2, which again is something that there has been debate on within the kind of academic sphere as well, as to whether that should even be allowed, because it can be covering up and not necessarily additional. But I would say, one of the things with the mitigation hierarchy is that it's not necessarily a temporal thing. All of these things that you can do can occur simultaneously. So if you are, employing as much energy efficiency in your sites and you're reducing your emissions as much as possible, and a thing like, the UK using more coal, which I hope wouldn't happen now that Rishi Sunak has made his latest statement at the COP. But if we did do that, you can still separately account for carbon credits that you purchase. You just can't pretend that those substitute value chain emission reductions. So, we don't condone a carbon neutrality claim. We don't condone that at all. It's just be very transparent about the fact that these are your emission reduction, or these are your emissions within your value chain. We know, we recognize that the UK started using coal, so we've bought these carbon credits to kind of compensate for it. There's nothing wrong with that, as long as you're not pretending that it's an actual emission reduction within your operations or your supply chain. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Thank you. I'm going to do one more question and then come to Q&A. So, also a bit of a curveball. Carbon neutral, net zero, climate neutral, carbon positive. Is it all just too confusing? And should we be, as an industry, simplifying things more? Yeah.
It is really confusing, and you can go further. You can say climate or carbon negative. You can say historical carbon neutral, historical carbon negative. I know we were talking before about a company's historic emissions and that sort of thing. So yeah, it certainly gets incredibly complicated. So all you have to try and do, my advice would be to try to put all of that to one side, all of the claim side of it to one side, and look closely at your own science-based targets initiative sort of hierarchy. You look at what are my carbon emissions currently, how can I effectively bring those down as effectively as I can, and those terms, those claims and stuff, think about those later. Don't necessarily focus too heavily on them, because they change so quickly and the public perception of those different claims changes every day. So it's very challenging.
Did you want to comment?
I would just say don't let, exactly what Andrew said, don't let claims be your motivating factor. Set a climate strategy and make it very clear and be very transparent. Set your progress reports, and then with those indicators, claims should not be it.
Don't get left behind. Right, questions on demand side strategies. You got the mic, so gentleman at the back there. Anyone? I'm just going to check if there's anyone else at the back, because I'm worried I'm missing people. No, okay, so that gentleman and then you next.
Hiya. So this is sort of a question on scope 2, I suppose. I'm coming from an SME standpoint. what did the panel think about REGOs? So, generation certificates in terms of suppliers that claim to be renewable using them, and is that sort of like a carbon credit, and how does that play into SBTi? Yeah.
So I'm going to turn that question to Maria, because we actually had a question on SMEs and I forgot to ask it. So did you hear it, Maria? Could you hear it clearly?
I think it wasn't, your question more was on the role of REGOs or RECs in terms of the strategy. So I think, again, it goes back into, REGOs are a bit different, or if I'll say renewable energy certificates, that's my understanding. So a renewable energy certificate is basically a project that issues that I've produced 1 megawatt hour of renewable electricity. And the idea behind that was that you could say that, okay, I've produced 1 megawatt hour of dirty electricity, but because I've bought 1 REC, that I've compensated for it. The only problem with RECs and REGOs on the contrary, what makes it actually interesting in between carbon credits versus a REC system, again, to the point on, it's not quite, you can't claim it as a compensation mechanism. One, because it's not quite like for like. I mean, you can do 1 megawatt hour of dirty, but what is dirty? I would go with what is the emission factor of that megawatt hour? And is it equivalent? So if you had something that was, gas, your megawatt hour was based on gas, that would be half the amount of what it would be for coal. And can you really say that's equivalent to REC? The second thing about it is, that was the reason why it was set up, was that it was a financing instrument for new projects. Again, the problem with that is that actually there hasn't been much proof that RECs actually allow, because these projects have already been set up. A lot of feed-in tariffs have already gone into enabling the financial additionality. It's very hard to prove financial additionality for RECs. So for SMEs, actually where we're seeing a lot more is corporate purchase power agreements on renewable energy. And that seems to be the thing that creates a real demand-side signal towards financing new renewable energy projects. I don't know if, Emma, you wanted to put that in, but...
Yeah, so this goes back to the kind of 2 different methods of accounting for your Scope 2 emissions. So the RECs and REGOs, they would fall into your market-based, and then there's location-based, which is the national grid. And yeah, I think, as Maria said, there's differing impacts on whether they actually have an effect. So in developed countries, where we have renewable energy development, there's little evidence to say that actually buying these certificates are driving any change. In developing countries, it's a bit of a different story. But with Scope 2 market-based accounting, there's another hierarchy that you can go up to. And as Maria said, the next stage along that is PPAs, so purchase power agreements. It's all detailed in the greenhouse gas Scope 2 guidance, if anyone wants to look into more detail. But again, yeah, I guess as a journey, you would probably want to start with buying a renewable tariff, but then move on probably as a cohort of SMEs or with larger groups to buy these purchase power agreements to buy larger amounts of electricity. Hopefully that answers the question, because I don't think any of us heard it, unfortunately, very well. Great.
Right. Ask a technical question and you get a technical answer. All right, we've got one in the front here and then another one over there.
Hello, my name is Anish. So this question is for Emma. Just an add-on to the RX part. Basically, now, when you sort of look at buying RECs in terms of, say, unbundled or bundled RECs, in terms of Scope 2 reductions, now, do they count in the 90% reduction that SBTi wants for companies, or would they still count in the 10% offsetting criteria?
You can use Scope 2 market-based to account for your value chain emission reductions, yes.
But you are both bundled and unbundled, correct?
Yes, okay. And I will say that because of the academic controversy that's happening at the moment, there's big debate about whether RECs do have any impact. I would say that most of this academic research has been conducted in the global north, Europe and North America, where it's a very different story. So at the moment, we are not taking a very hard-nosed approach on this because we work with global companies. So we might have nuance in that, but it may change in the future because they are re-looking at the guidance and it may be that, only things like PPAs or on-site solar, might count in the future. So it's just something to keep in mind and keep working up the hierarchy if you can.
But effective reporting would be to declare it in a separate line, so it's transparent, your use of RECs, So, here you go.
Good afternoon. I'm Thomas Harris here at Phoenix Carbon. I was thinking it seems that companies often feel that they need to choose between carbon neutrality and net zero. And I was wondering what SBTI's view was on that.
Okay, Emma?
Yeah. So this is an interesting one, and it's not for us. It can be both. It's an interesting debate in Europe in particular because I think that carbon neutrality and net zero have been kind of translated in the same way. So there's not, I think in English, there's like a distinction now, there's a growing distinction between carbon neutrality, which is something that you can achieve now, whereas net zero implies these emission reductions and aligning with that kind of 2050 latest goal. Whereas in Europe, there's a lot of, the way that the IPCC report has been translated as carbon neutrality. So it's getting really confusing, and I couldn't help notice your accent. Maybe know if that was if that was kind of where that was coming from. I don't. Depending on the context, I don't think that you should have to choose. I think it's something that companies can do, but I think it just should be backed up with the clear emission reduction targets that underpin that as well, rather than just kind of continuing with business as usual under carbon neutrality. Maria, did you want to add to that?
I mean, I think what SBTI did that was very helpful was to, for a company, define what net zero is, which is very much, it's a target state. So until you achieve 90%, at least 90% reductions by your baseline by 2050 with the rest removals, that's a very helpful definitions for companies to know that most companies are probably not going to have achieved that. But that doesn't mean you can do things that are on the way to net zero. And what that claim is normally is the carbon. Some places in the world put carbon neutrality to that. But just for everyone to be aware, the term carbon neutrality and its claims, that's the one where we're seeing most of the regulations coming out of consumer market authorities and guidance around that. So I strongly suggest to look at what the governments are going, and there's two parts of that claim. There's at the product level and at the company level. And it would be important to see what those regulations are, but it's very clear that communication is required.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point. I think in general there was a consensus building around net zero is aligned to Paris, so it's your Paris-aligned science-based target. Pathway to net zero is the stage to get in there, and carbon neutrality is what you're doing today, and then you need to compensate for all your residual emissions after reducing aligned to science. So I think we were sort of building a consensus around that. But I
have a question for you, Andrea.
Doesn't
ICROA have also for accreditation on carbon neutral labels?
On what?
ICROA's approach to carbon neutral labeling?
Yeah, so our approach is what I've just said in terms of sort of terminology, but we still support carbon neutral products. So where we would say if you as a company want to launch a carbon neutral product, it would be important not to do that in isolation, because it can look like greenwashing. It can look like you're presenting those products as your corporate strategy. And you've got to be very careful of that. So we would always advise, have your corporate strategy in place first, your corporate climate strategy in place. And then over and above that, if you want to look at particular products, which argue... Hello? which arguably would be part of your residual emissions, then those could be carbon neutral products. So that's the way we would look at it. Any more questions? Yeah, in the front here. Just trying to look at the time.
Yes, me again. So Reece from the Carbon Trust again. This is more on the sort of corporate net zero strategy side of things. We've seen that the US federal company is going to is mandating SBTIs as part of its procurement above certain thresholds. And I think we're seeing a direction of travel where everyone needs to set a science-based target or form in some form. So what I'm trying to understand is what's the messaging that we want to provide to some of our suppliers or customers in setting net zero targets that might be government organizations or academic institutions, non-profits, etc., where they realize how much work it is to set a science-based target, but actually don't get the validation at the end. So trying to understand, how do we bring people on that journey? Is there any advice? Is there any learnings from your side?
Okay, so if we're addressing that to Emma, I'm going to add on to that and say, and how do we help companies for which there isn't a sector approach, like the oil industry, the mining industry, steel? I don't think there's a sector-based approach for those. So just to build on that question.
Okay, I did wonder if it might be a question for Maria, but so I think for us, we were very excited about the White House announcement. And it's going to mean a big ramp up in capacity. We have ongoing sector-based projects. So the one sector that we do not accept at the moment is oil and gas. We are planning to develop a methodology. We're several years into developing a methodology, but we cannot reach consensus. So we've taken a different kind of governance approach, which is now taking longer. For all other sectors, they can actually use our cross-sector pathways to set science-based targets. So it's only the power sector and oil and gas that they have to use their own sector pathways once they're developed. So we do have steel now, we do have cement. We are kind of continuously developing those methodologies to help those companies, but it shouldn't be an inhibitor of setting science-based targets. I can understand that there are going to be lots. So the White House is not necessarily going to ask us to verify all of the targets, but many companies probably will want to do that. So we're going to be planning to massively ramp up our capacity internally. But I think there's probably going to be, we're probably going to have to be much more creative in the way that we scale, because the amount of companies coming in every year just continues to exceed our expectations. Waiting lists get longer, and that is just from our perspective and from companies' perspective unacceptable. So we really need to get creative on that. So that's from SBTI side. I think maybe Maria might be best placed to kind of provide some advice on what to say to other companies.
Well, thanks, Emma. So there's two things I want to highlight. One actually is government. A lot of these things it's great that the US government has actually set a procurement approach. Just to note, the UK government has done it for their construction contracts. So construction companies bidding in have to set out a net zero plan. What we've seen is, so NatWest actually, to help companies in measuring their carbon footprint, and this was really targeted at small, medium enterprises, so to support that capacity, because they don't have big budgets for consultants, which is currently what's happening for large companies. But for small and medium enterprises, we've launched Carbon Planner. So Carbon Planner is a interface in which you can actually measure your carbon footprint, figure out what your pathway would be from that, the suggested pathway, also the actions you can take and how much reductions would support. So it's literally the planning part for SMEs. It is not something that we would say, like the idea is something like that would be useful for using the SBTI framework on setting out a net zero strategy, but you don't necessarily have to. You could decide on it, but the critical thing with Carbon Planner is helping a lot of different companies. The idea is to roll it out in such a way that it can be, right now it's sector agnostic and it's for SMEs, but the idea would be for it to go beyond that. But this is what I would say a tool that the private sector has developed. There are many other tools that have been developed to support companies, and there are also a lot of consultancies. But here is where I say it's critical for government to actually start requiring beyond who they've required under actually a carbon tax or carbon price regime to start developing monitoring, reporting, and verification systems. So you actually have to measure it on site, get that data in a way that can be compiled so it can be usable across, so that you can actually do a carbon footprint. But again, the second part is government actually has policies in place that can drive that decarbonization story. So it's not just policies, but also infrastructure, technologies, that kind of things that actually make it possible for companies to enable and achieve those science-based targets.
Okay, I think, can we, let's take, there was one other hand up. This lady over here, I think the other one's gone, and then I think we'll make that the last one.
Hi.
Good. Yeah.
Arieta Dimitriou from RPS. So, can an organization claim that it's net zero carbon based on scope 2 market-based emissions and not location-based, and only based on scope 1 and 2 emissions and not scope 3? No. And if then we need to account for location-based scope 2 emissions and scope 3, then we need to buy carbon credits for including all of these.
So, so did everyone get the question? Yeah. Who would you like to answer that? Anyone in particular?
Yeah, I can answer that quite quickly. So yes, you have to include all 3 scopes. You can use either market-based or location-based, but you will be required to reduce all of your value chain emissions, so your company, your supplier, your customers' emissions, by 90%. So it will be a huge collaborative effort. But as I said kind of at the beginning, no one can achieve net zero in isolation, so we need this collaboration to get there. So the 10% that would be left at the end, then yes, you would be responsible as a company for buying carbon credits to neutralize those remaining emissions, even if they were scope 3.
Your removals, yeah. Okay, I think we are done. So thank you very much, everybody, for joining us, and thanks to our panel.
I think I'll just